Some of my children built highways to success, my father said, lifting his crystal champagne flute beneath the white roses and imported Italian chandeliers, and some chose to park at a dead end. The laughter wasn't loud, just polite enough to sting, just soft enough to make it look harmless, and every single head in that $250,000 Napa Valley ballroom turned toward me before quickly pretending they hadn't. I smiled. I've learned that when people expect you to flinch, the most unsettling thing you can do is remain still. The vineyard outside the glass walls glowed gold in the late afternoon light, rolling hills stretching farther than I could see, each table dressed in linen so thick it probably cost more than my first apartment's monthly rent. My younger sister, Sophia, stood at the center of it all in a custom silk gown, radiant, adored, perfectly framed by our parents' pride. The string quartet resumed playing as if nothing unusual had been said, and waiters in white jackets moved between tables balancing trays of champagne that sparkled like tiny trophies. I was seated near the back, close enough to hear everything, far enough to be forgotten in family photographs. My place card read, Evelyn Carter. No title, no description, no warmth. Earlier that afternoon, when I arrived, my mother had air-kissed my cheek and whispered, "Let's just enjoy Sophia's big day, sweetheart. No need to make comparisons." Comparisons. As if they hadn't been comparing us since we were little girls sharing a pink bedroom in suburban Connecticut. Sophia with her Ivy League acceptance letter framed above her desk. Me with a scholarship to a state school and a part-time job at a bookstore. Sophia with her engagement ring the size of a marble. Me with a divorce at 42 and a quiet apartment overlooking the Hudson. Dead end. It wasn't the first time I'd heard something like that. At Thanksgiving 3 years ago, my father had introduced Sophia to a neighbor as our investment banker, then paused before adding, "And this is Evelyn. She's still figuring things out." I was 68 then. I suppose they thought it was amusing. I folded my napkin carefully on my lap and watched the guests applaud as Sophia's husband thanked our parents for their unwavering support and belief. The irony didn't escape me. Belief is a powerful thing when you give it selectively. I took a sip of champagne. It was dry, expensive, and tasted exactly like it should. Across the room, a few distant cousins glanced at me with expressions that hovered somewhere between sympathy and curiosity. They were waiting to see if I would excuse myself, wipe away a tear, confirm the narrative. I did none of those things. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and listened to my father continue his toast about legacy, ambition, and knowing your lane. The chandeliers shimmered above him. The applause came again, louder this time, and I felt something inside me settle, not break. People assume a dead end is a place where movement stops. They forget it can also be a place where you quietly turn around and choose a different road. What none of them knew, what not even Sophia knew as she beamed beneath the vineyard lights, was that 24 hours after this reception ended, I would be in a Manhattan boardroom signing a contract worth more than this entire wedding. They saw a woman in a navy dress sitting politely in the last row. They did not see the documents in my leather briefcase, the calls I had taken that morning, the signature waiting for my name. My father lowered his glass and looked directly at me as if expecting some kind of acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude for being included in his joke. I held his gaze and smiled again, the same steady smile I've worn for decades. Let them think I was parked at the edge of the road. Let them believe the story they had repeated so often it felt true. The music swelled, guests rose for the first dance, and camera flashes lit up the ballroom like small bursts of approval. I remained seated, hands folded, perfectly composed. If they wanted a dead end, I would give them one. They just didn't realize I was the exit they would eventually have to walk through. The first person who approached me after the toast was my mother, her heels sinking slightly into the manicured lawn as guests drifted outside for cocktails beneath strings of suspended lights. She touched my arm with careful fingers, the way one steadies fragile glass. "You know your father was only joking," she said, her smile fixed and bright. I told her I understood. I always understand. That has been my role in this family for as long as I can remember. I watched servers pass with trays of miniature crab cakes and champagne refills, and I wondered how many understandings it takes before a person becomes invisible. Sophia joined us a moment later, her veil pinned up now, her cheeks flushed with attention. "Evelyn, are you all right?" she asked, tilting her head just enough to look concerned without smudging her lipstick. I told her she looked beautiful, because she did. She thanked me and leaned in to whisper that the wedding planner had kept everything within budget despite the imported florals and the 12-piece band. Within budget. $250,000, and that was considered restraint. I excused myself and walked toward the edge of the vineyard where the rows of grapes stretched in disciplined lines toward the horizon. The sun was beginning to set, casting everything in a warm glow that made even disappointment look romantic. I stood there long enough to hear my father laughing behind me, recounting stories of Sophia's promotions, her townhouse in Georgetown, her husband's venture capital connections. My name did not appear in any of those sentences. It never does unless it serves as contrast. I thought about the small apartment I moved into at 22, when I decided that asking for help would cost more than earning my own way. I worked evenings, saved carefully, invested quietly. While Sophia networked at charity galas, I learned to read balance sheets at my kitchen table. When she bought her first designer handbag, I bought shares in a logistics company no one had heard of. When she upgraded to a larger house, I reinvested dividends and waited. Patience looks unimpressive in photographs. It does not sparkle beneath chandeliers. It does not earn applause at weddings. But it compounds. I checked my watch. The time difference between Napa and New York meant the board would already be gathering in the conference room overlooking the Hudson. The documents had been reviewed twice. The numbers aligned. All that remained was my signature. I slipped my phone from my clutch and stepped a few feet farther away from the music. The call connected on the second ring. "We are ready when you are, Ms. Carter," the attorney said. His tone was respectful, steady, nothing like the indulgent affection in my mother's voice moments earlier. I told him I would be available first thing in the morning as scheduled. I did not need to rush. Success is far more satisfying when it arrives precisely on time. As I ended the call, I noticed my father watching me from across the lawn. He had that look again, the one that suggests he cannot quite decide whether I am a disappointment or a puzzle. I lifted my glass slightly in his direction, a silent acknowledgement, then returned to the reception before anyone could ask where I had been. The band struck up a lively tune, and couples drifted toward the dance floor. I remained near the back, observing the rhythm of it all, the choreography of pride and expectation. They believed they understood my trajectory because it fit neatly into the story they had written years ago. What they did not understand was that while they were measuring success in guest lists and wedding invoices, I had been measuring it in ownership percentages and long-term value. I did not need the spotlight tonight. The spotlight can wait. Tomorrow, beneath a different set of lights, in a room with floor-to-ceiling windows and a polished oak table, my name would be printed at the top of a document that changed more than my own direction. It would change theirs as well. They simply had not reached that part of the story yet. The reception ended long after the last violin note faded into the warm California night, and guests began collecting shawls and favors embossed with Sophia and Daniel's initials. And I left quietly, as I always do, before anyone noticed the empty chair near the back of the ballroom. The drive to San Francisco International Airport took just under an hour, vineyards dissolving into highway lights, and I watched the landscape change through the car window the way I have watched my life change, gradually and without announcement. My return flight to New York departed at 11:45 in the evening, and I slept very little, not because of discomfort, but because anticipation has a way of sharpening the mind. By the time the plane descended over the Hudson River at dawn, Manhattan looked exactly as it always does from above, steady, structured, indifferent to family hierarchies and wedding toasts. I went directly from the airport to my apartment on the Upper West Side, showered, changed into a navy suit, tailored years ago but still precise, and reviewed the documents one final time at my kitchen table where so many earlier investments had been studied in silence. At 9:30 in the morning, I stepped into the boardroom on the 32nd floor of a glass tower overlooking the river, where sunlight filtered through wide windows and reflected against polished oak. The executives stood when I entered, not out of obligation, but respect. "Good morning, Ms. Carter," the chief legal officer said, sliding the final contract toward me. The acquisition had been months in negotiation, a majority stake in a promising technology logistics firm that had expanded quickly but miscalculated its burn rate. They needed capital. I needed strategic expansion. It was a simple equation. one that did not require applause to validate it. I read every page carefully, as I always do, then sign my name in steady script. The ink dried quickly. Ownership transferred quietly. No string quartet played. No chandeliers glittered. Yet the weight of that signature carried more permanence than any toast offered the night before. After the meeting concluded, I remained seated for a moment, watching the river traffic below move with deliberate rhythm. My phone vibrated against the table. Sophia's name illuminated the screen. I answered. Her voice was bright at first, still wrapped in honeymoon euphoria, until it shifted. Evelyn, this is strange, but Daniel just found out that his company's largest new investor is you. Is that right? I confirmed that it was. Silence followed. Not hostile, just stunned. I did not know you were involved in this level of financing, she said carefully. I told her there were many things our family did not know about me. She laughed lightly, unsure how to place that statement. A moment later, my father's voice joined the call through speaker. You bought into Daniel's firm? He asked. I explained that I had acquired controlling interest, which meant the board now reported to me. There was another pause, heavier this time. I could almost see him recalculating the story he had told at the wedding, searching for a revised narrative that would preserve his authority. Well, he said finally, that is impressive. It was the first time in years he had used that word in reference to me. I thanked him, not for the compliment, but for the clarity of timing. From the boardroom window, I watched sunlight scatter across the Hudson like a field of small mirrors, each one reflecting something different depending on where you stood. I did not raise my voice. I did not remind them of vineyard jokes or ballroom laughter. I simply outlined the restructuring plan that would stabilize Daniel's company and increase its long-term value. My tone remained calm, measured, professional. On the other end of the line, I heard respect begin to replace assumption. The hierarchy had shifted, not through confrontation, but through consequence. As the call ended, I gathered my papers and walked toward the elevator, my reflection faint in the mirrored walls. They had mistaken quiet for stagnation, patience for lack of direction. Now they were beginning to understand that while they were celebrating visible milestones, I had been building foundations beneath the surface. The difference between a dead end and a turning point is often invisible until someone decides to change direction. I had decided a long time ago. By late afternoon, the calls had begun to multiply, not frantic, not dramatic, but measured and carefully worded, as if each sentence had been rehearsed before it reached my ear. Daniel called first on his own, his tone respectful in a way it had not been at the vineyard. He explained the cash flow challenges, the expansion missteps, the optimism that had outpaced reality. I listened without interruption, because numbers speak more clearly than pride ever does. I outlined the conditions attached to my investment, the oversight structure, the timeline for restructuring. There would be no ceremonial leniency, no family discount, no emotional amendments. Business requires clarity. When the call ended, I felt no triumph, only alignment. That evening, my parents asked if I would join them for dinner the following week when they returned to New York. The invitation arrived as a text from my mother, filled with exclamation points that suggested enthusiasm, or perhaps urgency. I agreed to meet them at a restaurant overlooking Central Park, a place my father prefers because the view makes conversation feel elevated. When we sat down together, the tone was noticeably different from the one beneath the chandeliers. My father studied the menu longer than necessary before finally looking up at me. You should have told us, he said, not accusing, but unsettled. I asked him what exactly I should have disclosed. He hesitated. That you were building something on this scale. I folded my hands on the table, the same way I had folded my napkin at the wedding. I told him that I had been building for decades. The scale had simply grown. My mother reached for her water glass, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. We always assumed you preferred a quieter life, she said. I smiled slightly. Preference and presentation are not the same thing. I explained that I had chosen privacy because performance had never interested me. Sophia had always enjoyed the spotlight. I had enjoyed leverage. My father nodded slowly, recalibrating his understanding of the past in real time. He mentioned the toast, calling it a misguided attempt at humor. I told him I had not been hurt. That was only partially true. Pain fades. Perspective remains. What mattered was not the joke, but the assumption behind it. For years they had equated visibility with value, volume with importance. I had never argued. I had simply invested. Over dinner, we discussed the restructuring plan for Daniel's firm. I described the operational adjustments, the capital infusion, the long-term strategy that would secure its future. My father listened intently, asking questions he once would have directed towards Sophia's colleagues. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Respect does not always arrive with apology. Sometimes it arrives with comprehension. As dessert was served, my mother leaned back and studied me with a softness that felt less like comparison and more like recognition. "We may have misunderstood your road," she said quietly. I told her that roads look different depending on where you stand. From the outside, patience can resemble delay. From a distance, silence can resemble stagnation. But direction is not determined by applause. When we left the restaurant, the city lights reflected off the pavement like scattered constellations. My father paused before getting into his car and placed a hand on my shoulder. "I am proud of you," he said, the words careful, deliberate. I thanked him, not because I had been waiting for them, but because it was better for all of us that he had finally said them. As I walked home along the park, I considered how quickly narratives can change when facts replace assumptions. They had believed I was parked at the edge of possibility. In truth, I had been mapping routes they never thought to explore. The difference between their perception and my reality had always been quiet. Now it was undeniable, and I did not need to raise my voice to prove it. In the weeks that followed our dinner in Manhattan, the tone of our family conversations shifted in small but measurable ways, like a market correcting itself after years of inflated assumptions. Sophia called more frequently, not with the casual brightness she once used when updating us about gallery openings or weekend trips to the Hamptons, but with thoughtful questions about long-term planning and sustainable growth. Daniel attended every board meeting prepared and attentive, his posture straighter, his language more precise. I did not demand deference. I demanded accountability, and that difference mattered. One afternoon, as autumn began to settle over New York and the trees in Central Park turned amber and crimson, my mother invited me to visit the old house in Connecticut where Sophia and I had grown up. I had not spent much time there in recent years. The colonial facade looked unchanged, white shutters, a wide front porch, the maple tree in the yard now taller than the roofline. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of polished wood and history. My father sat at the kitchen table with a stack of photo albums, something I had not seen him open in decades. "I have been thinking," he said as I took a seat across from him. He slid one album toward me, stopping at a page where Sophia and I stood side by side in elementary school uniforms. Sophia's ribbon was larger, brighter. Mine was slightly crooked. "We always pushed her forward," he admitted quietly. "We thought you did not need it." I studied the photograph. I had not needed praise to work. I had needed belief to feel seen. "There is a difference." I told him that I had never resented Sophia's opportunities. What unsettled me was the assumption that I lacked ambition simply because I expressed it differently. My mother joined us with 3 cups of coffee and listened without interruption. Outside, leaves fell in deliberate spirals across the lawn. My father closed the album and rested his hands on the table. "I measured success by visibility," he said. "You measured it by permanence." The statement lingered between us. For the first time, it felt less like correction and more like understanding. Later that afternoon, Sophia arrived. Unexpectedly, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors she once ran across as a child. She embraced me longer than usual, and when she stepped back, there was no competition in her expression. "I did not realize how much you were carrying quietly," she said. I told her that quiet does not mean empty. It simply means focused. We walked through the house together, past the staircase where we once argued over borrowed sweaters, past the living room where report cards were compared at the end of every school year. The memories felt softer now, less sharp. In the backyard, the maple tree cast long shadows across the grass. Sophia looked at me and smiled. "You know," she said, "Daniel told me yesterday that the best decision he ever made was accepting your terms instead of resisting them." I nodded. Respect built under pressure lasts longer than admiration given casually. As the sun dipped lower, my parents joined us outside, and for a moment we stood together without roles, without rankings. Just 4 people connected by history. My father cleared his throat. "We misread the map," he said simply. I looked at the house, at the yard, at the tree that had grown taller without announcing its progress. "Maps change," I replied. "So do directions." The air was cool, the light fading, and for the first time in years, the silence between us did not feel like absence. It felt like equilibrium. They had once believed I was standing at the end of something. Now they understood that I had been standing at the beginning all along. Winter settled over New York with a deliberate calm, the kind that quiets the streets and sharpens reflections in glass towers. And as the year drew to a close, I found myself standing once again in a room filled with chandeliers. Though this time the setting was not a vineyard, but a charity gala hosted by the Metropolitan Business Council overlooking the Hudson. The ballroom glowed in soft gold light, tables dressed in white linen, donors and executives exchanging measured laughter over glasses of sparkling water and wine. My name appeared on the program not as someone's sister or daughter, but as keynote benefactor. When I stepped onto the stage, the applause was warm but contained, the kind that recognizes contribution without spectacle. I spoke about sustainable investment, about building foundations that outlast trends, about patience as strategy rather than weakness. I did not reference family, comparison, or correction. I spoke only about vision. Afterward, as guests mingled beneath tall floral arrangements and floor-to-ceiling windows framed the river in darkness, I noticed my parents standing near the back of the room. They had arrived quietly, invited by the council after learning of my involvement. My father's posture was straighter than it had been months earlier, not from pride alone, but from recognition. My mother's expression carried a softness that no longer felt like apology but appreciation. Sophia and Daniel stood beside them. Daniel now confidently discussing expansion metrics with another executive, while Sophia listened with genuine interest rather than competitive instinct. When they approached me, there was no awkwardness, only clarity. "You handled yourself beautifully," my father said, his voice steady. I thanked him, not because I needed affirmation, but because acknowledgement completes a circle. Sophia reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. "I used to think success had to be loud to count," she admitted. "You proved otherwise." I told her that loudness is only one measure, and often the least durable one. As the evening continued, I watched my family move through the room differently than before. They introduced me not with qualifiers, not with contrast, but with direct respect. The narrative had shifted, not because I demanded revision, but because reality insisted on it. Later, when the crowd thinned and the river reflected the city lights like scattered constellations, my father and I stood side by side near the windows. "I once thought ambition needed an audience," he said quietly. "You built yours without one." I looked out over the dark water, steady and expansive. "Some structures are stronger when they cure slowly," I replied. He nodded, absorbing the metaphor without defensiveness. There was no need to revisit old words spoken under vineyard lights. They belonged to another context, another understanding. What mattered now was the recalibration. On the drive home, I considered how easily people mistake visibility for value, speed for direction, applause for achievement. I had never been interested in convincing anyone of my worth. Convincing is temporary. Demonstration is permanent. As I entered my apartment and set my coat aside, the city humming softly beyond the windows, I felt no surge of triumph, only equilibrium. The path I chose had never been about proving others wrong. It had been about proving myself consistent. In the end, the most profound shifts rarely arrive with noise. They arrive with quiet certainty, the kind that does not require repetition. And as the year closed, I understood that what had once been labeled a limitation had simply been a perspective waiting to expand. Early spring arrived with a brightness that felt earned rather than sudden, and with it came the annual shareholders meeting for Daniel's company, now restructured, stabilized, and positioned for steady expansion rather than reckless acceleration. The meeting was held in a glass conference center overlooking the Hudson, the same river that had witnessed my quiet decisions months earlier. This time, however, the room carried a different energy. Investors spoke in measured tones about sustainability. Board members referenced strategic pivots with confidence rather than anxiety, and Daniel stood at the front presenting quarterly results that showed modest but consistent growth. There were no dramatic leaps, no inflated projections, only disciplined progress. I watched from my seat at the head of the table, hands folded, listening carefully to the cadence of the room. Sophia sat beside me, reviewing notes on a tablet, no longer as an outsider to financial language, but as someone who had taken the time to understand it. After the formal presentation concluded, a longtime shareholder raised a question about leadership stability and long-term direction. Daniel answered thoughtfully, crediting the restructuring plan and the board's oversight. Then he did something that shifted the air in the room. He turned toward me and said, "Our strongest asset has been patient leadership. Without it, we would not be here." He did not elaborate. He did not dramatize. He simply acknowledged. The room responded with quiet nods rather than applause, and that felt appropriate. Stability does not need spectacle. After the meeting, as people gathered their briefcases and exchanged measured congratulations, my father approached with a posture that held neither correction nor comparison. "You changed the trajectory," he said plainly. I told him that trajectory is rarely changed in a single moment. It bends gradually, often unseen. He considered that for a second before nodding. Outside, the river reflected the pale blue of early afternoon, steady and wide. Later that evening, our family gathered for dinner at Sophia and Daniel's apartment in Georgetown, a space that once symbolized achievement in my parents' eyes. The view of the city was impressive, the furnishings elegant, but what felt different now was not the setting. It was the tone. Conversation flowed without ranking. Success was discussed without hierarchy. Sophia asked about my upcoming philanthropic initiative focused on financial literacy for women over 65, and she listened with genuine interest rather than polite detachment. Daniel described long-term innovation goals with humility instead of urgency. At one point, my mother looked around the table and smiled in a way that felt unguarded. "We were always so focused on who arrived first," she said. "We forgot to ask who would last." I met her gaze and felt no need to correct the past. The present was sufficient. After dinner, as I stood near the window looking out at the lights stretching across the horizon, Sophia joined me. "Do you ever wish you had been louder?" she asked softly. I thought about it carefully. I had been underestimated, overlooked, occasionally dismissed. But louder would have meant reacting rather than building. "No," I said finally. "Volume fades. Structure remains." She nodded, absorbing the distinction. As the evening ended and I stepped into the quiet hallway outside their apartment, I realized that what had once been framed as a limitation had become the foundation for everything that followed. Not because I demanded recognition, but because I earned consequence. The labels that once floated so casually in bright rooms had dissolved under the weight of reality. And the most satisfying part was not that they had seen where I ended up. It was that I had known all along. Summer returned to New York with a steady warmth that softened the sharp edges of memory, and with it came the launch of the financial literacy initiative I had quietly funded for women over 65 who believed it was too late to learn the language of ownership. The event was held in a renovated brick building in Brooklyn, sunlight streaming through tall industrial windows onto rows of folding chairs arranged with practical precision rather than decorative flourish. There were no chandeliers, no string quartets, no champagne towers. Instead, there were notebooks, pens, and a projector screen displaying the words "Long-Term Strategy Begins Today." I stood at the front of the room wearing a simple navy blazer, looking out at faces lined with experience and resilience. Some of the women had spent decades supporting families without ever being taught how to support themselves financially. I recognized something familiar in their posture, a quiet determination often mistaken for limitation. When I began to speak, my voice was calm, deliberate, unhurried. I told them that understanding capital was not about becoming loud or flashy. It was about gaining options. I explained compound interest, risk assessment, and the power of patient allocation. I shared how small decisions, made consistently, could reshape a future more effectively than a single dramatic move. As I spoke, I noticed my parents seated in the third row, listening intently. Sophia sat beside them, taking notes, her expression focused rather than distracted. Daniel stood near the back, speaking softly with one of the program coordinators about potential corporate sponsorship. Months earlier, we might have occupied separate worlds. Now we were aligned by purpose rather than perception. After the presentation ended, several women approached me with quiet gratitude, not because I had dazzled them, but because I had given them structure. One woman in her early 70s held my hand and said, "I thought I missed my chance." I told her chances are not tied to age. They are tied to awareness. Later that afternoon, As the room emptied and volunteers stacked chairs against exposed brick walls, my father walked over and surveyed the space. "This feels more meaningful than any gala," he said softly. I agreed. Visibility impresses. Impact sustains. Outside, the city moved in steady rhythm. Taxis passing, construction cranes stretching toward the sky, people hurrying with purpose. Sophia joined us and glanced back at the modest stage. "You built something that outlasts applause," she said. There was no envy in her tone, only clarity. I looked at her and smiled. "Applause fades," I replied. "Access remains." That evening, as we gathered at a small restaurant nearby, the conversation flowed easily. There were no comparisons, no rankings, no subtle reminders of who had arrived first. My mother raised a glass of sparkling water and said, "To direction." It was simple, but it held more weight than any elaborate toast beneath vineyard lights. When I returned home and stood by my window overlooking the Hudson, the city glowing against the dark water, I thought about the long arc of perception. Once, a single sentence spoken in a bright room had attempted to define me. Now, that sentence felt smaller than the work, unfolding in rooms like the one in Brooklyn. I did not need to correct it. Reality had already done that. And as I watched the river move with quiet certainty, I understood that the most profound destination is not a place others finally see. It is the place you always knew you were heading. Autumn returned again, almost exactly 1 year from the night beneath the vineyard lights, and this time our family gathered not for spectacle, but for something far simpler. My parents hosted a small dinner at the Connecticut house, the maple tree now taller and steadier, its leaves turning gold in deliberate silence. The table was set with everyday plates rather than imported china, and the guest list was short. Just us. No investors, no colleagues, no curated applause. As we took our seats, I noticed something subtle but meaningful. My place was not at the edge of the table. It was beside my father. No announcement marked the change. It simply existed. Dinner unfolded without ranking achievements or comparing milestones. Sophia spoke about the gradual growth of Daniel's company, the steady rhythm that now defined their business instead of dramatic surges. My mother described volunteering with the Literacy Initiative in Brooklyn, helping women open their first brokerage accounts. Daniel discussed a new mentorship program for young entrepreneurs who lacked access to capital. The conversation felt balanced, like an orchestra finally tuned to the same key. At one point, my father set down his fork and looked at me directly. His voice carried none of the playful irony that once filled bright rooms. "I have been thinking about something I said last year," he began. The air did not tighten. It settled. I confused visibility with value. I will not make that mistake again. There was no elaborate apology, no attempt to dramatize regret. Just clarity. I nodded once. The past did not require excavation. It required acknowledgement. After dinner, we stepped outside into the cool evening air. The yard was quiet, the maple leaves rustling softly in the breeze. Sophia joined me near the fence line where we once argued as teenagers about who would leave first and who would succeed faster. She smiled at the memory. "We were both so certain the race mattered," she said. I looked at the house, at the porch light casting a steady glow. "It was never a race," I replied. "It was always direction." She exhaled slowly, absorbing the distinction. Inside, my parents began clearing dishes together, moving with the familiarity of decades. There was no hierarchy in their movements, only partnership. I realized then that what had shifted was not only how they saw me, but how they saw success itself. It no longer needed to be displayed to be believed. As the evening came to an end and we prepared to leave, my father placed a hand on my shoulder once more. "You were never standing at the end of anything," he said quietly. I met his gaze without urgency, without triumph. "I know," I answered. The drive back to New York felt calm, the highway stretching forward in clean lines beneath the night sky. I thought about the long arc of that single sentence spoken beneath chandeliers and vineyard lights. It had once attempted to define a destination. Now it felt like a misplaced signpost, pointing nowhere. Direction is not determined by who announces it. It is determined by who sustains it. As I entered my apartment and looked out over the Hudson once again, the city lights reflecting against steady water, I understood something with absolute clarity. Where I ended up was never the point. Who I became along the way was. And that was something no toast could ever measure.